situation I come across quite frequently is an overly literal interpretation of the contract of employment. By that I mean I have met employees regularly who will look at their contract, which may have been drawn up many years ago, and are prepared to work within the very narrow confines of that contract, but are not prepared to go outside it. And as the workplace evolves and as the business perhaps evolves, they are inclined to stick with a literal, technical, legal interpretation of their existing contract. But what they fail to look at, and what they overlook frequently, is that there is an implied term in the contract of employment that you as an employee will follow reasonable direction. What is reasonable direction in any particular circumstance will depend on the job and depend on the role and depend on the contract. But if the direction is reasonable, even though it may be a slight change from what's set out in your contract, which, as I say, may be 5 years old, maybe 10 years old, you do as an employee have to adapt yourself to the changing circumstances. And provided the request or direction is reasonable, you would be expected to follow it, and you would be expected to perform this implied term. This is a similar situation to a person who has a contract and there's a description or a schedule at the end of the contract, and it sets out their duties. And their duties may be fairly narrowly defined or narrowly prescribed, or they may be broadly prescribed. But the employee then, when they are faced with a new task or a new job to do, look through this list very, very closely and decide, because what they're now being asked to do is not included in the list, they don't have to adapt themselves or don't have to follow this new direction. That's not the case. Again, it comes back to the simple fact of the matter is that there is an implied term in the contract that you will follow reasonable direction. What's reasonable, as I say, will depend on the circumstances of each case. For example, if you are a receptionist, for example, or a secretary, then it wouldn't be reasonable to expect you or ask you to clean the boss's car or to wash his car or cut the grass at his home at the weekend or anything of that nature. However, if you were a maintenance person, perhaps it would be reasonable to expect you or to ask you to do some routine maintenance, perhaps at his home or something of that nature. But again, that would depend on the actual contract. Again, if you're a brain surgeon or a heart surgeon or something like that, we all know the broad definition or the broad scope of that sort of role. So what's reasonable and what's not reasonable will be looked at in the context of the job and so on. But what I would caution against is an overly literal, overly legalistic interpretation of what's actually set out in the contract. And if, for example, you're in the security industry and you're working in a particular location for a while, even though the contract may be silent about geographical mobility, if you're being asked to move from one site to another and it's not 1,000,000 miles away, then almost certainly there's an implied term in your contract that you would have to move, unless you have a specific express term in your contract saying that you're going to work on this site and this site only. So I hope you don't fall into this mistake, which I see quite regularly. A, the contract of employment being employed or being interpreted or being construed very literally, and B, the schedule or description of tasks, etc. If what you're being asked to do now is not included in that, you down tools and are not prepared to do it. I don't think that's a sensible strategy to adopt. I don't think it's a reasonable one to adopt, and I do think there is an implied term in most contracts that you will follow reasonable direction, and what's reasonable in any situation will depend on the situation and depend on the contract. Hope you find this video useful. If you do, you might give it a thumbs up down below. Thank you.